Welcome to another episode of the Untitled Chapter podcast. I'm Nachum Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored anonymously in honor of Rabbi Zev Siegel. Rabbi Siegel was the rabbi of Young Israel of Newark for 33 years in the mid-90s and served 3 terms as RCA president. He was instrumental in building Orthodox Judaism in America after the war. May his neshama have an aliyah. This episode of the podcast is also sponsored by koshercloth.com. One thing I appreciate about koshercloth.com is how easy they make buying stam. Whether you're looking for tefillin, mezuzahs, a megillah, or even a sefer Torah, they take the time to explain their options, answer your questions, and help you find what's right for your needs and budget. To learn more, visit koshercloth.com or call or WhatsApp 516-737-5436. They have pickup options in New York and New Jersey, as well as fast shipping across the country. You can find the link in the show notes below. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me svarmchatter@gmail.com, or you can find links and information in the show notes. You can also find the link in the show notes to subscribe to the Svarm Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and more. And there's also a link to the Svarm Chatter WhatsApp status if you prefer to get things that way. Programming note related to this episode: this is focused on Isaac Leeser, one of the most important and influential figures in American Jewish history. I recorded a lengthy episode, about an hour and 20 so minutes, with Professor Lance Sussman, who wrote the biography of Isaac Leeser. And then there is a 20-minute additional recording with Rabbi Elazar Meisels, who is the dean of Sarah Schneer Institute for Higher Learning, who has taught about Isaac Leeser in the past, and we wanted to emphasize Isaac Leeser's impact today and on Torah Judaism, so we added that as well. And I hope you enjoy this episode and this entry into the series about the early American rabbinate. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and another episode here in the series about the early American rabbinate. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Lance Sussman, who is the author of the book Isaac Leeser and the Making of American Judaism, published by Wayne State University Press. And we will be talking about Isaac Leeser, the Reverend Isaac Leeser. I want to start also that this episode is being sponsored anonymously, Le'ila Nishmas, the Reverend Isaac Leeser, Yitzchak ben Uri, or Uri Eliezer, but probably Yitzchak ben Uri, and in memory of him and his impact on American Judaism and the many things that he wrote and the many deeds that he did, as you'll hear about in this episode. Thank you, Professor Sussman, for joining me.
That's beautiful. Thank you. That's wonderful to hear that. Yeah.
That was from a friend of the podcast, a real avid listener who is a big fan of Leeser, and he told me of your book as well, as we'll talk about with
deep gratitude on that. Yeah.
How did you become interested in Isaac Leeser?
My wife wanted to get a master's degree in counseling, so I decided the best thing for me over the summer of her studies was to approach my teacher, Dr. Jacob Marcus, who was kind of the founder of American Jewish history, and say, do you have a for credit project for me? And I worked with him all summer in his home with documents on American Jewish cultural and education activity between 1790 and 1830. And I wrote a great big term paper, kind of infamous in the history of the Hebrew Union College because it was the length of a thesis, but it was a summer project. And it was very clear to me that specifically after 1830, that the American Jewish story very much focused on Isaac Leeser. And although there was some secondary literature on him, there was no full-scale biography. So for my master's degree, I studied his discourses. And then for my doctorate, I did a critical biography,
which later became the book, which was published. So let's just briefly talk about the Jewish community around the time that Leeser arrives from Germany. So, the time period you just mentioned, but really towards the latter half of the beginning half of the 19th century, 1810, 1820. What's the Jewish community, the situation like in the United States?
So the Jewish community is very small, just a few thousand people. It's still mostly coastal as it was colonial. Jews had pushed a little bit inland, and by inland, I mean places like Baltimore that's not right on the Atlantic Ocean, and Richmond, Virginia. And it so happened that Leeser had relatives in Richmond. through his mother's side. He had come to the conclusion, or his family had come to the conclusion, that he didn't have much of a future in Germany. It wasn't really Germany yet; it was the Holy Roman Empire. But there was no real path forward for him, and he had some ideas as to what he wanted to do. One of them was to become a pharmacist. And so, like many young and single men, he came to America and studied with family and became involved in the local synagogue. And then there were events that put him into the spotlight. But the overall Jewish community, there were 10 or so synagogues. They were all traditional. They were mostly Sephardic, and when I say Sephardic, they were of the Portuguese flavor of Sephardic. The first Ashkenazic congregation was Rodef Shalom here in Philly. They date themselves to the end of the 18th century, and then you had, right at the time when Leeser came, a split in a congregation in New York City, so that Shereth Israel remained Sephardi, and the next congregation was Ashkenazi. So it was pretty much a tiny Jewish community of a few thousand people. And through marriage and correspondence, they pretty much knew each other. It was, we use the metaphor of family, but in many ways it was very much a well-connected family, and the right hand knew what the left hand was doing.
Right, and this was, as this has been discussed in other episodes, and I've discussed this at times about the situation in American Judaism, the Spanish-Portuguese community, really Sephardi community, but there are definitely some German Jews, as Isaac Leeser. So Leeser is born in 1806 in Germany, and let's dive right into him, and we'll get more into the Jewish community throughout this episode as we discuss his move here and what happens. But let's discuss when he's born, where he's born, his family, and so on, his basic biography, if you will.
So he's born in a little village near the Dutch border in Westphalia. And this is the period of Napoleon. And you have the beginning of westernization. You do not yet have civic emancipation of the Jews, but there are definite cultural shifts. There was limited educational opportunities in his village, so he moved from Neuenkirchen to Dulmen and ultimately to the provincial capital of Munster, where he entered a secular gymnasia, but also took lessons from what was called the Landrabbiner, who was a rabbi by the name of Abraham Sutro, who happened to be a good preacher. He was a darshan, and I think the young Leeser, part of him was actually inspired. So he did his Jewish learning on the side. It's important to note that he was not trained as a Talmudic scholar. He didn't receive any sort of smicha. He was a village Jew who had a natural spirituality, which drew him to the synagogue and some Jewish learning. And I want to say, because I think it's important, he never presented himself as more than what he was. He didn't claim to be a rabbi. He didn't claim to be a PhD. In Hebrew, he signed his name Hakaton. He was ambitious about promoting Judaism for Jews, but he never made claims about himself that weren't true. And that is different than some of the other religious leaders of the period who greatly exaggerated their qualifications. So he was a humble and honest guy.
And at a time when it was hard to verify, so you had, like you said, well, you had rabbis coming, whether they came as Orthodox, it became Reform, they came as Reform, and you mentioned, the other names, Isaac Meir Wise.
No, there was no way to verify.
Yeah,
there were no schools really along those lines. The professionalization hadn't set in, but he stayed close to the truth on who he was.
Yeah, and that's why he always, we'll get to later, he was a reverend, and he was a chazan. He wasn't a rabbi. He never went by rabbi. He wasn't trained. He was an autodidact, really, but he was, he
He
learned.
was really more of a shaliach tzibur even than a
Yeah,
hazan, because there's no indication that he had an operatic kind of voice. So he knew who he was in that regard, but he saw the need for Jewish books and Jewish learning in America, and there he became active.
absolutely.
Absolutely unstoppable.
As we'll get to. I mean more by Chazan as the term. I did an episode in this series with Professor Jonathan Zarna on Gershom Seishes, and we discussed Chazan as the term Chazan was used in the America of the time as kind of this, like you said, more than just a Shlech Tzibur. You would think of a Chazan today.
Right.
You would think of at the time it was like a mini rabbi, quasi-rabbi, if you will, even though he wasn't a rabbi. So that's Leeser. So Leeser, his uncle moves here, and that's why I'll give away. That's why he moves to the United States at 17. But what's really the impetus for his move? He's going to pick up was young, as a teenager, and moved to the United States.
The promise of America, the hope of economic security. He wasn't really fleeing from persecution at that particular moment in Westphalia. So I would say it was primarily economic, and it followed a chain migration. He was received by family, so it's not like he was going to be on the street or peddling or anything like, very, very harsh conditions. So he had a family here to receive him who were already middle class, and he jumped the pond. He jumped the pond.
Now, his uncle and his family were in Charleston. So they're in South Carolina. They were not in New York or Philadelphia, where he's going to end up living.
In Richmond, Virginia.
Richmond, Virginia. Sorry, thank you for clarifying. So, yeah. Go ahead. So how did he end up? So his uncle's in Richmond, Virginia. So he ends up in Richmond, Virginia. And what does he do when he goes to Richmond, Virginia?
So he goes there. He has to learn English. He becomes active with the synagogue there, which is Sephardic. And my teacher, Jonathan Sarna, coined the term. He Sephardized his Judaism. He was an Ashkenaz from Germany, and he picked up on the Sephardi minhag and was active in the synagogue. And the moment of truth came. He was still a young guy in his 20s. In the local newspaper, an apostate Jew was published a series of articles which defamed Jews and Judaism. And he was not going to let that go. So he wrote letters to the editor, and eventually they're collected and they become a book in which he mounts a rational defense of Jews and Judaism. Judaism is a beautiful religion. Jewish people were not of bad character. And because as I said earlier, because the American Jewish community is small and well connected with one another, it comes to the attention of Mikveh Israel congregation in Philadelphia, one of the original colonial congregations. And they invite him to become, we were debating the term Hazan, for him to be the prayer leader, spiritual leader of the congregation, knowing that he was not a musmach, but that he knew how to lead the prayers. And that was typical of the American Judaism of that whole period before the Civil War. Was kind of the last person off the boat who had capacity for being a Schatz, somehow rose to leadership in the congregation, but on a limited basis, because the synagogues did not have ordained rabbis, and they had a very powerful tradition of lay leadership. Because they were Sephardi, they used the term junta. And, to some extent, they behaved like juntas. They were very, very powerful. They were oligarchic. Most of them were well-to-do. They were property owners, et cetera, et cetera. And they wanted a person to lead the prayers, teach the boys bar mitzvah, but they really did not want leadership beyond that. it was their world. The junta determined the spirituality of the congregation, and Leeser steps into this role. He's invited to go to Philadelphia, and his real goal in going to Philadelphia was to go to the University of Pennsylvania, and this was going to be his stepping stone. But he gets there and he discovers that there aren't books, the education is inadequate, and he starts assuming various responsibilities for himself. And that immediately puts him into tension with the lay leadership. And that his whole 20-some years at Mikveh Israel is extremely contentious, because he's saying, look, we need to be publishing Siddurim. We need to have a Tanakh for American Jews. We need to be teaching the service. We need to do all these things. And they're saying to him, be quiet, daven, and don't do so much. Nobody's asking you to take on all these other responsibilities. And he says, I have no choice. If Judaism, he came to a conclusion, and this is one of the central things about Isaac Leeser that everyone should know, and that he had come from Europe with all types of restrictions, and he comes to the United States where you have freedom of religion and freedom from religion. And he comes to a conclusion as a young man that it is possible for Judaism to flourish in an environment of freedom where, if Jews are educated in Judaism, they will choose to lead Jewish lives in America, and you don't need the persecution to force them back in, and you don't have to be afraid of the centrifugal forces of assimilation to take them out. Teach them to love the tradition, to have a personal relationship with God, and Judaism's going to flourish in America. And he absolutely believed in that. He absolutely believed in that. And we're seeing that today, by the way. It's taken centuries for people to come to the same conclusion. But he felt that traditional halachic Judaism could flourish in America, and that we didn't need anti-Semitism to push Jews back to the inside. That's his biggest contribution.
Absolutely. What would he say today? And if we would see that today, but we'll get there. But he was a man of conviction, and he really, like you said, he wasn't just going to sit and go daven and lane and whatever else he was doing. He was going to know he was actually going to do more than that.
Right.
And so he goes to Philadelphia. He's brought Mikveh Israel, one of the, like you said, the early colonial time communities. This is Gershom Seixas. When he leaves New York and Shevet Israel, he goes to Philadelphia. He becomes the chazan there for a while in Mikveh Israel. This is, and as you said, it's run by the board. So you have the Parnas, who Seligman Phillips, I think, is the one that he's in tension with for a while in the beginning.
Terrible relationship, yeah.
Terrible. And as it's related in your book, I think something that comes across throughout the book, and anyone that reads about Leeser, is that he's fighting about his contract, about the money he's being paid, and how they're treating him. And this is constant throughout his career. And spoiler alert, it ends up with him quitting, essentially walking away after 20-some years. And he's a very famous, influential figure in American Judaism, not the figure then, when he just says, forget it, I had enough of this. And so this is something that goes on throughout his career there. But he moves to Philadelphia, and he takes over, and he starts there. But it's interesting, how did the community find this young German Jew? This is a Sephardic community. How did they find this young German Jew to be their chazan? How did they get a hold of him?
It's because he published letters to the editor in Richmond, and people sent copies to their friends and relatives in Philly, and they said, whoa, this guy knows what he's talking about. His English had become very, very good. He was articulate. I'm not sure what his voice actually sounded like, but he certainly was articulate and had a full command and was comfortable in American culture. And they recognized that this guy could provide them with the kind of leadership, that the kind of capacity, let's call it. They didn't want too much leadership, but they wanted capacity. And so they asked him to come up north, and he said yes. He was a young, unmarried man, and he was on the move.
I want to read just a little excerpt. It's quoted in your book from these letters, because you can get a sense of the young Leeser. And I think it's worth noting, and he was writing this at a time America was very Christian. There's something, although there was freedom of religion, freedom of the press. This is in the early 19th century. He writes, whatever of moral beauties the Christian religion may have, ours is no less beautiful, no less effective in raising our ideas from nature to nature's Lord. To love him, to confide in his goodness and special protection is commanded to us in almost every page of Mosaic writings. To love our neighbor as ourselves is no new doctrine of the gospel, for this obligation was known already since the promulgation of the law, which commands, and thou shalt love thy neighbor like thyself. Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel spoke of the resurrection and the life everlasting, and reward for the righteous and punishment for the wicked. What are the glorious truths which the Christian religion, for the first time, made known to a world sunk in darkness? I am absolutely unable to discover which and where they are, and I should therefore be much indebted to any professor of Christianity who could point out any moral doctrine which was not long previously taught by our prophets and rabbins. So really, really very well put, and he's writing very forcefully, very strong in the 19th century.
He has a backbone, doesn't he?
Absolutely. You see it right there from that little quote right away. You can see that there's a man of conviction.
Now, what it recognizes is, the period of the revolution itself, an early nation, very secular and kind of deistic religion. But that is followed after 1800 by what's called the Second Great Awakening, particularly in Protestant Christianity. So the country is kind of on fire spiritually with Christian faith. And, Leeser understands on the one hand, there is freedom of and freedom from religion in the United States. On the other side, he recognizes that despite that, the United States was a very religious society, and we still have that anomaly today if you compare us to a country like France, in which you have a government-sponsored secularism. You don't have that in the United States. The American Enlightenment itself was warmer toward religion than Voltaire was in France. So he understands that the terms of the separation of church and state in America protect the right of Jews to practice Judaism, but on the other hand, that the missionary fervor of Christianity was on fire at this moment when he's reaching adulthood and beginning to have a leadership role. And his answer to that is there is no reason why Jews can't have the same fervor in their own faith in America, because there's nothing here to restrict that. The government is not going to shut you down. And the missionaries who would literally blockade the front of synagogues during this period were out of bounds. They were not behaving according to the American rules of religion, so to speak, live and let live. And the Jews weren't living up to their own religious obligations. He was going to fix that. This tiny little guy with an adequate education felt called upon that he had to do something to strengthen Judaism in America. And nothing, no matter what trouble he got into, nothing dissuaded him from his purpose.
Yeah, as you'll see throughout the rest of this episode, anyone that reads your book or reads Leeser's writings, and we're going to get to more of that. So he starts off, the contract is negotiated. It's $800 a year for 3 years, I believe. Or is it 5 years? How much $800 a year at the time? Like, his salary, was that considered decent? Like, what kind of salary?
Poverty level. Many of the synagogues, they would even bring down the salary and add firewood in the winter, things of that nature. In England, they had something called the pounding system, where people brought pounds of bread to the local minister in lieu of payment. So he was paid at a very low rate. I don't know the exchange to 2025, but it's only, it's below the poverty line. He rents a room. That's where he lives. He's not capable of actually owning a house. I don't believe he ever owned a house. He was below that level, so he wasn't property. But after a while, of course, because of his work, he has friends, but he uses all of that money towards the work. It's all towards writing books about Judaism and not any kind of personal wealth. So he has a minimal contract, and he is as concerned, in my opinion, about the term of service as he is the actual compensation. In other words, he wants some security. I have work to do, he says to himself. I need to be teaching. I need to be writing. After a while, I need to be preaching, which we should talk about. And in order to do that, I need a longer runway. So you can't give me these short contracts at minimal salary and expect me to do my job. And then they fight with each other like cats and dogs.
Always. I want to just get to one more thing there before we get to the preaching and some other things, is that the Cherem incident of Henry Weil, which occurs early on, which is something that they decided, the Cherem, this was something the same way it was done in Amsterdam and in these Sephardic communities, it would be leveled, it would be a Cherem by the board, by the Parnas. And then they told him, you go out there and you read the Cherem on this guy. And he says, no, I don't agree with the Cherem, I'm not going to do it. And then they censored him because he stood up to them.
Correct. Cherem in the context of pre-modern Europe was painful punishment because there was no neutral society. So either you were in the Jewish community or you were in the Christian community, but there was nowhere to go in between. In America, it is essentially, I know there's a lot of Christian fervor here, of course, but there is also a neutral secular society, so that Cherem was essentially meaningless. And, if you didn't want to belong to a synagogue, you didn't belong to a synagogue. And that probably was the majority position. I think, and I'm guessing here, that the reason that Leeser refused to take orders is, first of all, he probably didn't think that the junta, who was lay and had no rabbinic authority, could issue a writ of Cherem like that. That would be one thing. The other was he wanted to win Jews back to Judaism with honey, so to speak, and not with a lash. So he felt it was against the necessary strategy of winning Jews over to America. Don't punish Jews for being wayward. Show them that a synagogue can be a beautiful place. Show them that Shabbat at home can be a beautiful experience. Bringing them in that way, and don't reinforce the unsubstantiated power of the junta, which was based more on property and wealth than it was on any kind of learning.
Yeah, and he stood up to them. So you mentioned preaching, and this is something we should discuss. His sermons, or it's published in 10 volumes, I think. If he publishes it once, and then later on, the second series, his discourses, which he's very proud of. And this is something that he preached. Let's talk about preaching in the synagogue in general at the time. And what's going on, as a chazan, this is not a rabbi. And so, I discussed with Professor Sarna about Gershom Seishes, who would preach from time to time, not that often. Isaac Leeser decides early on he's going to preach. And why did he decide that? How often did he preach?
Europe is a complex situation. In the context of early nation America, there were occasional discourses and addresses in the synagogue, usually for, let's say, the proclamation of a day of Thanksgiving before Thanksgiving standardized, or the end of a plague, or something like that. There were no there were no mufim in the country. You had people like Gershom Seishes who were autodidactic and could give a good talk. By the way, very interesting blend of Enlightenment rhetoric with traditional Jewish rhetoric, trying to tie those two things together. But it was ad hoc. It was ad hoc. What I understand about Leeser is as follows: that he comes into the congregation because he wrote these letters to the newspaper, and it was recognized that he had ability. He was approached by one of the leading women in his congregation, Rebecca Gratz, who was from one of these well-to-do Sephardized families, who was herself a very spiritual person. Her letters are now being transcribed and they're online at Gratz College, and there's an excellent biography of her, etc. And she's born right after the revolution, um, and and she would go, actually, believe it or not, to church with her friends because there weren't a lot of theaters. There were some. There certainly weren't movies. There weren't Broadway productions. And very often a good preacher was a good entertainer. So she was not a stranger to hearing a sermon and then discussing it with her Gentile girlfriends. She, in my opinion, the way I understand this, approached the young Leeser and said, "Why don't you give a talk on Shabbat morning? Because us women in the congregation get no Jewish education at all. The boys learn enough to do a master, okay? But why don't you talk? And we're going to sit in the balcony and we're going to learn, okay?" And he likes the idea. Now, remember, as a youth, he had heard Abraham Sutro, the Land Rabbiner, back in Westphalia, and he knew a little bit about preaching. And preaching was everywhere in America. Everybody, all the churches, people are preaching in the churches, evangelicals out of the churches. It's a major cultural expression. So he takes it upon himself to create a discourse. He uses the term discourse. And it's a real problem in the synagogue because, as we all know, services can be long. And if you get somebody who likes to really extend the music, you're going to be there for 5 or 6 hours, right? So a question arose as to if he was going to talk, when could he talk on a Saturday morning? And the compromise that they reached was after Adon Olam, so that technically services were over, and the men mostly left, and the women with Rebecca Gratz sat up in the gallery and listened to his talks. And he loved to prepare these discourses. He would publish them in what later would become his journal. He also prepared them as books. He viewed them as a kind of religious record of his efforts. One of the things I discovered about his preaching was that all of his sermons were biblical exegesis, no Talmud, no Midrash, straight biblical exegesis. But in many ways, they were coded messages. So that, for example, if there had been a tremendous earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal, and there were thousands and thousands of casualties, he would happen to speak on the justice of God. So one of the things I had to do was try to connect, and I think I succeeded largely, but some of it I may have fictionalized. I don't know. Others are going to have to judge that his sermons were kind of coded into the headlines without speaking about the headlines, because I think that would have been considered very bad manners. And then once reform begins to find spokesmen, he will use these discourses as a way to attack the doctrinal changes that reform was suggesting. So there'd be series on the Messiah and things of that nature. So he begins to preach, and he views this, for all of his endless accomplishments, as really the hallmark of his rabbinate. My master's degree was to analyze his 10 volumes of discourses. I went through them, I indexed them. And, this is, I don't want to be unkind. There wasn't a good sermon in the whole collection. They were dry biblical exegesis, they were doctrinal, I got so bored at one point doing my work that I started counting the number of words per sentences. He was a German immigrant, so he was used to 200-word sentences with endless uses of semicolons and things like that. But he would come to a point, he would make his point, and that is that, and this is the sense in which I believe you have to call him orthodox. Orthodox meaning correct doctrine. What he spoke about was, what does Judaism believe? What does traditional Judaism believe based on Torah, Sinai? He doesn't use the phrase himself, and that any doctrinal deviation is simply not allowed nor necessary, because Judaism was given by God and was complete and needs to be loved and respected by the Jewish community. And he works extremely hard at preparing these messages, very lengthy messages, probably 45 minutes or so, on correct doctrine, which I would define as the narrow definition of orthodox.
That's something you get to in your at the end of the book, in the epilogue, and we can discuss more. That you say that because he fought reform vigorously, but that's because some in the conservative movement later on tried to claim him as conservative, which he wasn't. But we'll get there shortly. So, Leeser, the discourses, as you say, you don't seem such a fan. Was your master's, was that ever published anywhere?
No, it was the jumping off point to the doctor. I knew I was going to stay. I did the normal search for graduate schools, but the reality was at that moment, back in the early 80s, both Jacob Marcus and Jonathan Sarna were both at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. They were the two, the old man of the field and the rising star of the field, and I was not going to match that combination. So I stayed, and the agreement was I was already so deep into Leeser that I should stick with him. So with the blessing of my doctoral advisors, I simply stayed with the program and began the broader research of a biography.
Right, but that analysis of the discourses was never published. Okay.
It's his very first sermon was called Confidence in God, Bitachon, and that's what I called my master's thesis. And no, it wasn't published. It's on record at the Hebrew Union College. It's a pretty big, hold on a second. Here's my master's thesis.
Wow, pretty big.
It's a ton and a half. It's a ton and a half. And it focuses very heavily. And I have charts on when he spoke and what he talked about. I don't even know how many pages. It's over 300 pages long.
Wow.
I had the tradition at the Hebrew Union College was when you wrote your Master's of Art thesis, you had it bound. They had an interesting man there. He was the book maker, whatever the right term is, to the King of Romania, and he ended up working in the basement of the library of the Hebrew Union. So we have these elegantly bound. So this is my study of his sermon.
So, as you said, he spoke about the Messiah, and that was against, I think, missionaries, and he also spoke against reform. And this was something. Well, let's talk about reform and his fight with Isaac Mayer Wise and others. I mean, this spans many years. One of the things that he recommends Poznansky for his job, I think that's in Charleston, South Carolina, and then that goes south, and he's kind of embarrassed that he recommended him, and that's the whole thing with Raphael is there, and then Wise is there, and Wise says he doesn't believe in things, and that this is something that he's busy with, fighting with Isaac Mayer Wise and others about reform. So this was one of Leeser's big fights, if you will.
Yeah. So when we talk about reform, it's really at two different levels. The United States is still a frontier society, and it's very much a frontier Jewish society. By the time of the Civil War, the United States is continental. You have California on the West Coast, and you have 30 million people, of whom 150,000 are Jewish, who are mostly in the larger East Coast cities. There's 200 synagogues. Of all of that, only 6 synagogues are Reform. So how much of a threat did Reform really constitute here in the United States? Not a tremendous amount. However, at the same moment, Reform is spreading in Central Europe, and it is attracting properly ordained rabbis. Let's say somebody like a David Einhorn who goes to the yeshiva of Firth, who's probably a musmach, but then goes on to get a PhD in various topics, usually philology at German universities. So all of a sudden, Reform is developing a brain trust in Europe. They're running into all types of political problems, and slowly, they begin to migrate to the United States. And I think what Leeser was trying to do was to limit the influence of Reform here in the United States, quote, before it got out of hand. And in fact, the Reform movement in this country is pretty well contained during his lifetime. I think he has to deserve some credit, and it's not really to after the Civil War. The war itself does create a new kind of spirituality in the United States, but Reform doesn't really start to grow in the United States to after the Civil War, and Leeser is gone. He passes in 1968. So I think he saw his job. He was the watchman. He was the Shomer Yisrael, and he wanted to contain Reform while he could. And I think he actually succeeded a great deal. At the same time, he wanted a dignified service, but maintained the traditions. He didn't want mixed seating. He wanted the full service. He didn't want abbreviations. In the prayer book, he didn't want to cut out what Reform would call redundancies in the prayer book, et cetera, that it should stay in the Hebrew language. The full Torah portion should be chanted. So he wanted to maintain the synagogue in its traditional fullness, but presented in a way that was culturally desirable.
Yet he did kind of, what the word is, not work together, but with Wise, especially on the Cleveland conference he attended. The other Orthodox rabbis at the time, I think Rice was here already, didn't go and were upset about it. He went, and then he left in middle, and then they advanced certain things that were not good, and this eventually played out. So he was trying to accomplish something with that didn't, but again, others were upset that he even was working with them at all.
Correct. And it cut in different directions. So the Cleveland Conference of 1855 is really the first rabbinic conference here in America. Remember, by that point, conferences in Europe were already about a quarter of a century old. And the idea of rabbis coming together was not something new, but for the United States, it was unprecedented. And Wise viewed himself, first of all, as the great leader of American Judaism, and that he could create a middle position in Judaism that the majority of American Jews would follow. Leeser, on the other hand, who was much more humble as a person, believed that Judaism in America needed to stay traditional, and for the most part, actually Sephardic, although he does produce and print Ashkenazic prayer books, but without editing them. It's the full Hebrew text. And there was a question of whether these two men, these titans, so to speak, could come to any sort of agreement as to what they should all be working toward to create what Wise called a Minhag America, an American Judaism. And they worked out 6 or 7 issues, and then they got down to the authority of the Talmud. And what would be the role of the Talmud in deciding American Judaism? Remember, you only had a handful of rabbis in this country, starting in the 1840s, who had any training in Talmud at all. Leeser did not have training in Talmud, but he respected its authority in Jewish life, and then the codes and everything else that follows from there. And they were trying to work out a compromise. It's like a typical political treaty negotiation, and they were getting very close, and he was getting wise to weaken his position about non-authority of the Talmud when at that moment when they're meeting in Cleveland, a rabbi by the name of David Einhorn gets off the boat in Baltimore. And he is a doctor rabbi who had been to the conferences in Europe. He is a radical reformer. He's a believer in German reform. Even here in the United States, he believed that Reform Judaism had to stay in the German language so that it was part of the German culture and German philosophy, unlike Wise, who was an Americanizer and said, let's put it into English and let's modify reform in a traditional direction. Einhorn gets off the boat and blasts Wise, saying that he's a sellout to the Orthodox, and he scares Isaac Mayer Wise away. And that is part of what will push Wise very slowly into the reform camp. Because Wise, in my opinion, ultimately thought his destiny was to be the leader of the Jews in Judaism in America. And he had trouble with these new German rabbis getting off the boat who were so ideologically entrenched in the new radical reform. And it separated the two men. They have a strange relationship between Wise and Leeser because both were important. Both had their own newspapers. And I found a quote once that this is not an exact verbatim quote, but Leeser writes to Wise, Isaac Mayer Wise, and says, "You are my best friend in this world of flattery and deceit."
Yeah, there's a nice quote you quote in your book when Leeser dies, what Wise writes about him. I'll try to find it. And, you mentioned the newspapers and realized we're like 45 minutes in and we have not mentioned Leeser's, I think, most important endeavor. Certainly, well, there's a bunch of publishing endeavors which we'll get to, his Siddur and his Tanakh and so on, his translation. But maybe the most important and the most well-known is The Occident, which is his newspaper that runs for 20-something years, his periodical, if you will, newspaper. It's a monthly. Let's talk about it, why he decides to found that and what that is. This is an extremely important.
So it starts in 1843. It's called The Occident, an American Jewish Advocate. And I think he sees it as a parallel to a periodical in Europe called the Orient, the East. So this is the Occident, the West. And the United States has become a big country. It's not yet linked by rail all the way across the country, but it's in communication with one another. And he needs a way to communicate broadly with the American Jewish community. And he needs a mechanism for general education so that he serializes his own discourses. He invites other people to write theological pieces. He finds pieces by British Jewish authors. He has material translated from German into English. He has Moses Mendelssohn's Jerusalem translated and serialized into the Occident. He has parts of Moreh Nevuchim from Maimonides translated, and so this is going to be the great educator. So he can reach 100, 200 people from his pulpit, but he can reach hundreds of people through a newspaper. And it was became common after the 1840s, 50s, 60s that any, quote, rabbi of distinction in America had their own newspaper. And that was their mobile pulpit, so to speak. He has an office for the Occident. Most of the primary material that we have about Leeser is the correspondence that he saves back and forth, preparing the monthly Occident. For a short period, it goes to a biweekly. It also has an advertising section in it. So if you're the only Jew in a town in Wyoming and you want a parrot to fill in, there's an advertising section where you can get it, and it begins to create a marketplace for the things you need to make Judaism work in America, and it becomes quite important. The main opposition came from Isaac Mayer Wise, who has a paper called The American Israelite, the American Israelite, which again shows his highly Americanistic view, where I think it's the Occident and Jewish advocate, where Leeser's message is in the West, traditional Judaism can maintain itself. One thing that he does that's particularly interesting is he invites women to write. He encourages belles lettres, poetry, short stories, etc. Nothing that would interfere with any kind of halachic prescription about the role of women, but he does give them a venue. Wise does the same thing, but in German. So he has the Israelite in English, but he has the Deborah, which is a German parallel that's principally for women. So the Occident is tremendously important. And then when any issue comes up, he has this mechanism to share it across the country. So for example, when the Swiss government denies a visa to a American Jewish businessman to do business in Switzerland because he's a Jew, Leeser protests. Okay, he protests and said, look, the flag this follows the citizen, and Jewishness in a sense is irrelevant because under the American flag, this man should not be penalized for being a Jew in Switzerland. And I'll give you another case, which is really interesting to me. There was a convert to Judaism by the name of Warder Crescent. There's an article about him called The Shaker Quaker Rabbi. He was a spiritual seeker, and he tried several different religions. He ends up converting to Judaism and living in Jerusalem. Okay, he's from a wealthy Quaker family, and they contest his financial holdings and saying because he had converted to Judaism, he was non compos mentis, which in essence was arguing that if you converted to Judaism, you were crazy. And Leeser takes that up as a cause célèbre, which is an important precedent in American culture, that conversion to Judaism is not an act of insanity. It's a personal choice. It's a personal choice. And the list of headlines here is endless. It's absolutely endless. I think the way readership worked in those days was, somebody would subscribe in a given town, and then it would be passed around, and a lot of people would read it. So the readership was bigger than the subscription list.
So I'll mention a couple things. On Cresson, Shirley Bornstein did a really fun raid bite on him, and Cresson is buried in Har HaZeisim. And I think Andrew Porwencher is working on a book on Cresson now, and that whole case, which is a fascinating case, and from the law angle as well in this country. Now, also, as you mentioned, the newspapers were kind of their social media of the day, if you will. They would put anything out there to be able to reach everyone. So Leeser, and this is something you also emphasize in the book, he really believed in freedom of the press and freedom of speech in the sense that he would publish even things from Wise. There were things being published that he didn't agree with, and he would print them, and then he would push back and say, no, I don't agree with this reform position or whatever it is, which was quite interesting for someone that was trying to push back. So he would publish all sorts of things were published in the Occident, which is fascinating.
Well, it's sort of a Hillel Shammai, Elu Elu kind of approach to it. And I think he felt by exposing a guy like Wise, could defeat him, that he had argument.
And he definitely fought with Wise. Another thing that gets printed in the Occident, which is that, as we mentioned earlier, right from the get-go in Mikveh Israel, there's tension between Leeser and the board and the Parnas. Well, that goes on, and 20 years later, he's this successful publisher now of this periodical, and the board tries to, we'll skip all the other ones. For all the details and all the fighting and the money and the contracts, they can, check out your book, which will be a link in the show notes to purchase. But when it comes to the end, Leeser is upset, and he's so incensed that he publishes about it in his paper, which is kind of like airing your dirty laundry in public. And I don't know how smart of a political decision that was. And so tell the listeners so he publishes about this fight that he's having with his employers, if you will, and that doesn't end well.
They go back and forth against each other. There are all types of unbelievably vicious publications against one another, and it ends up, you're fired, I quit. And that's how that ends. But what will then happen is he does have supporters within Mikveh Israel. They establish their own synagogue, and Leeser becomes their spiritual leader. Plus, he now has some wealthy friends across the country who help to subsidize his educational work, and he starts his Bible project by subscription. So he begins to do things that he is not dependent on the well-being, the support of a particular synagogue, and certainly not to have a board that would try to control him. He didn't want to be controlled as a person because it wasn't about him. It was about Judaism. It was about teaching Judaism, and he felt that they were in the way of his ordained work, his destiny. And from their point of view, is they said, lead the prayers and go home.
It's so important to remember that. And some other things to remember about him. First of all, his uncle, who he was very close with, who he first came to in this country, Zalma Raheen or Ryan, he was always tempering him throughout these fights. And the last one, his uncle had passed away, so he wasn't around. This is a point that you make in the book.
Yeah. There's another psychological piece to Leeser that's very important. He was stricken with smallpox.
Yes.
Which deformed him.
And his brother died from it. His brother caught it from him when he was in a coma, and then his brother died.
So his brother Jacob comes to take care of him from Europe when he goes into a coma. And while Leeser is recovering, his brother dies. And typical of, let's say, 19th century religion, when he comes to, when his strength comes back, he says, his brother gave his life for this. Isaac has to double down in his efforts. This is a tribute to his brother. For his brother's chesed, he owes it to God to double down on his work as a teacher of Torah.
So he, like you say, he has smallpox, he's pockmarked, he never marries.
He doesn't marry. I was able to trace, there were distant relatives, Gentiles, still living in Germany. I heard from a few, but no blood descendant, unfortunately.
Yeah, he never married. Another thing to point out about him as well, which is, I think you mentioned before, he was a Nanav, he was really humble. He won of the fights through one of the years, I believe in about 1837 or so, they brought in this Jacques Judah Lions, and there was a fight, and they were trying to bring in someone else, and in the end, Leeser is reelected. But one of the times, I believe he allowed Lions to test out, be like at the proba, if you will, trying to test. And then when Lyons leaves, I believe he writes him a letter of recommendation, which is amazing. You're writing your potential competition, and he says, no, I'm going to help you out.
It was typical of the American synagogue to have these contests for who was going to be the Hazan Shaliach Tzibor. And it gave enemies of the occupant an opportunity to try to overthrow them or bring in somebody who they thought would be better for the congregation. The particular example you picked there, Jacques Judah Lyons, is really an important figure in American Jewish history. So far as I know, he was the first person to start collecting the primary sources of American Jewish history. So he puts together a very important collection of the documents of American Jewish life, 18th and 19th century. So he actually he doesn't get the job, but in a larger sense, he plays a very important role in preserving the American Jewish record and giving us the capacity to study it. And that later, those documents will be published by the American Jewish Historical Society.
And I believe Lyons, in the end, goes to She'eretz Israel?
Yeah.
And then I think he even officiates by Leeser's Levaya.
Yeah. At different points, you can be enemies and you can be enemies and friends at the same time. You can have a dispute with a person and still love them. We all know that. Life is complicated. And they respected each other, I think, because they really believed in their life's work.
Absolutely. So let's move on to Leeser. There's so much to talk about with him, but let's talk about education. You mentioned education is such an important part. Leeser is attempting many different avenues of education. He opens a school, it fails. He's involved with the Sunday schools of Rebecca Gratz that I've discussed on other episodes. You can talk about that. And he eventually opens Maimonides College, which ends up failing after he dies. So there's just many, he writes a catechism. He's very involved with education.
Yes. Well, education is everything. And it's the education of the young through these schools and different catechisms and manuals. And it's the education of adults through discourses and books and making a Jewish Bible available so they don't have to rely on the King James. And he never desists from that task. It's very, very difficult in an environment in which the idea of Jewish education is to train a 12-year-old to be ready for a bar mitzvah and then drop them like a hot coal. That it's really a lifelong mission to learn. And he gets that, and he does everything in his power to sustain it, even creating the first Jewish Publication Society in America to start publishing Jewish classics. Unfortunately, his warehouse burned down. Fire is a huge problem in 19th century America. And I guess he didn't have insurance, so it wasn't revitalized until the end of the 19th century. Again, in Philadelphia, it's something I'm writing about now. And actually, Jonathan Sarna has written a whole book on the history of JPS. But it was his idea that we needed a press to publish Jewish classics in America, that we shouldn't be writing to England or to Amsterdam to get our materials, that we should be able to generate all of that here, and we should be able to train our own people here in this country.
JPS being the Jewish Publication Society, he, as you said, established the forerunner of what will become JPS. And yeah, Sarna has a book.
First version of it, yeah.
Correct. It kind of, then it burned down and it closed down. Also, a catechism, just for those that aren't familiar, is like a summary of like basic beliefs or principles. It's popular in the Christian world, and it's like question and answer. Yeah.
It's question and answer meant for memorization. And it was typical of religious education, Jewish and Christian, in the 19th century. The problem he had with it wasn't really his catechism, but the first one that he publishes is a translation of a German catechism, Jewish catechism, and it's too highfalutin. The original, what they called Hebrew Sunday schools, were run by women, and the women often had a better sense of what the kids were capable of. Now, the Sunday school movement starts in his congregation at at Mikveh Israel. And again, it's the idea of Rebecca Gratz, and he supports her in that idea. It begins at the same moment as the expansion of public schools. So either you're going to have a full-time Jewish education, or you're going to have kids going 5-6 days a week to public school and have limited time for Jewish education. And then what exactly do you use those precious hours for, and what do you try to put into their heads? And it tended to be doctrinal, but he does support Rebecca Gratz. And it's interesting that the original Sunday school movement was all women. They were not attached to synagogues. It became a national movement, and it's not until later in the 19th century that the Sunday schools and the synagogues begin to merge with one another. Here in Philly, there's for decades there's an independent Sunday school society not attached to synagogues.
Yeah, and I did
And by the way, there's a social uplift dimension to it as well. It was tuition free, and they aimed at getting the newest immigrant and poor children in, and to make determinations. For example, did they have a proper winter coat? So if a kid would come on a cold day to Sunday school without the proper wrap, they would make sure he would go home with it.
Amazing. And Rebecca Gratz, and Rebecca Gratz, who started, was wealthy, from wealthy family. So that's really was an amazing thing. And now let's talk about Leeser, his translation of the Siddur that he published, translation of the Bible, the full Tanakh that he did. And as you mentioned, I thought this is great. You point out in the book that the irony is then the Reform movement ends up using it for many years, and Leeser is the archenemy of Reform, and that's the one that they end up using.
Right. His first project really was to get the Torah, they would call it Pentateuch, in Hebrew with Masoretic notations, the Nikud, printed so Jews would have that. Then the prayer books, both in Sephardic and Ashkenazic, with translation, so that they were rather long, so that there would be proper siddurim here. And then his biggest project of all, maybe in his whole life, was to translate the entire Tanakh, the entire Hebrew Bible, into English. There was no Hebrew English version of it, and to do it in English, the original, what they used to call pulpit size version, had a small commentary to it. He wanted it translated according to Jewish sources because, for the most part, Jews in America, when they wanted to read the Bible, used the King James Bible and then skipped the New Testament. And there's a number of verses, virgin birth, things like that, whether a verse is Christological or not, that they wanted that he wanted there to be an authentic Jewish English language Bible here in the United States. Now, that vernacular project goes back, firstly, of the Reformation and Luther doing that, but then in the Jewish world, you have Moses Mendelssohn translating into German, but the Mendelssohn translation uses the Hebrew letters. It does not go into the Roman alphabet or fraktur. There are Jewish translations of the Bible according to Jewish sources in Germany, and my sense is what Leeser did, being a native German, was to take probably the leading German Jewish translation, and then comparing it with he had Rashi and other commentaries to make sure that where there are verses that are elliptical, verses that can be translated in different ways, that it would come out as authentically Jewish. And the Leeser Bible, although he dies in 1868, the Leeser Bible was the standard English language Bible for Jews in the United States until the new JPS comes out with their 1917 edition. and then that becomes the standard Bible. And it has gone through different versions at this point. What's interesting is the original JPS of 1917 was a little bit expensive, and a publishing company in the Lower East Side picks up the Leeser Bible and is able to print it cheaper. Okay. After I had finished my doctoral work, I grew up in Baltimore and Pikesville, and I was visiting my father's mother, who I called Nana. And I was, I guess, poking around in her house, and looked at her night table, and what was in my grandmother's night table? Leeser's Bible. And at that point, I said, "Boy, there really was a plan here, like Yosef and the Bible. There really was a plan that I should be involved in this kind of thing." And that's a little bit exaggerated, but it was a very warm feeling. So,
wow. So you found some connection that you had there. So Leeser.
Yeah, I had another instance where a leading family in Mikveh, Israel, their name is Salas Cohn. They were when I was teaching in Binghamton, New York. They had belonged to Mikveh Israel in the Leeser period. In fact, had named one of their children Isaac Leeser Solas Cohn. And on the occasion of his birth, Leeser gave them a Sephardi prayer book and signed it. Okay. When I left Binghamton, New York, they gave that to me as a matana.
So you still have that?
I had all these wonderful things happen because of this.
Wow, that's cool. So Leeser things sell for a lot of money. So I guess you still have that signed by Leeser.
Honestly, I don't view them as a commodity. To me, it's Yerusha. It's very precious.
Absolutely. And we were talking before, and I'll mention this because we're talking about now his discourses that he prints, and I want to talk about some of his other works, and we talk about the Tanakh and the Siddur, that his works sell for so much money. They're such a commodity today. But does anyone read them? And he was very proud of what he wrote. The discourses, I think the first 2 volumes, he printed only 500 copies, and he said they sold out right away. And I know you said before you didn't enjoy them, but he said people enjoyed them. They sold out, and he was very proud of that. He went to reprint it. He did the second series, and this was something he was very proud of his writing, and it's a shame that people aren't reading it.
It came from a different world. You didn't have radio, television. You didn't have movies. If you take the example of classical music, you would have a piano in your home, and somebody was able to play that music, and you would sit around and listen to classical music live. And you felt a different connection to it. Today, you put it in your earbuds or something like that. And so you get the classical music live. At the same time, you have the Occident of Leeser with a sermon in it, with a discourse on Judaism and doctrine. And I believe that people, not the whole family necessarily, but they would sit there and either read it to themselves or read it out loud and have some discussion. And that met his purposes, because it was culturally, such a different world than we live in today.
Totally different.
Nobody was doing the Nachi podcast, You had to sit down and read it for yourself.
You had to read the book, or your book on Leeser, which, by the way, everyone, this podcast is only a small sampling. You should definitely read it. It's a fantastic book, I will say. And I told you this, and I'll say this live. I read this about 7 years ago, and then we never did the podcast, and I reread it now to prepare for this. It's a wonderful read. There's a lot of information, and it's really important to read about Isaac Leeser. I want to talk about his other writings. He had some other publications as well. Do you want to mention some of his other works that he published?
So he has the prayer books, the Bible, the Occident. He has his catechisms, and then he has a couple of collections. For example, his original letters to the editor, where he prepares defenses of Judaism. So there's a small series of books like that as well, as part of the corpus of Leeser literature.
I think Jews and the Mosaic Law, right?
Yes.
One of them.
Yeah, that's an example of a defense of Judaism.
And then let's get to the end of Leeser's life. At the end of his life, so towards the end, after Mikveh Israel, he has this new congregation, new synagogue that he's part of. And then after that, at the end, he's sick and he's busy with the Occident. He's busy with publishing his discourses. At the end, he's working on that. And then he passes away he's nifter in 1968. He's buried
there was
Philadelphia.
There was kind of a race to establish a rabbinic school in America. So Wise was one of the first to talk about that, Zion College, back in the 1850s. After the Civil War, Leeser is able to put together Maimonides College. Remember, he is Sephardi, so he goes for the Rambam. And they have a small faculty, and they open their doors in Philadelphia, but it can't sustain itself without him. And when he dies, it very quickly unfolds, although they do, quote, ordain 4 rabbis. And then that's beginning 1868. And it takes to 1875 before Wise opens the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And at that point, Wise was still hoping to have a seminary for all flavors of rabbis, but very quickly it becomes specifically Reform. That's a whole nother Geschichte. It's actually a lot of fun to talk about it today because the misery has been removed from that story at this point. He's even after the war, he is still in the fight and comes to believe that we need American-trained rabbis to lead American synagogues. The community is still overwhelmingly immigrant, but at a certain point, their children are going to take over, and culturally, they're going to need to relate to a non-immigrant rabbi.
Yeah, Wise is very important. And so stay tuned for the episode on Wise in this series. And Wise plays a larger role than we've been discussed with Leeser, the back and forth and the arguments and disagreements that they have. And you're talking about the Hebrew Union College and then the infamous Treifa banquet. That's something that will be discussed. Stay tuned.
I'm the guy who wrote the article on the Treifa banquet. So you can look me up. It's on reform, the radicalization of reform food policy.
Yeah, that's an infamous story. So perhaps we'll do a little piece. We'll put together some different things on Wise. Well, stay tuned. Listeners should stay tuned for the episode on Isaac Mayer Wise. But at the end of Leeser's life, I do want to read a quote from Wise, which I thought was nice, which is that Wise, reflecting on the death of Leeser in 1868, Wise wrote, I'm quoting from your book again, page 243. We cannot write the biography of Isaac Leeser without writing our own, a task which we do not like, because for the last 20 years we worked either with or against each other. We had many a controversy publicly and privately which did not sound very friendly. Nevertheless, we never became so far estranged to each other that we were not on speaking terms or could not meet each other cordially on any occasion, because we never offered each other any personal insult, nor did we at any times disrespect each other. And then he pointed out that Leeser is the banner bearer of tradition, and he says all the rest of their leaders are of local importance only, while he, by his literary efforts, his travels, his numerous acquaintances, his unfeigned attachment to his cause, and his consistency had a widespread influence. We know of no man in America who will replace Isaac Leeser in the Orthodox camp. He had a cause to plead, and he did it without fears or favors. He did not beg the favors of this or that order, this or that party, this or that man. He did not yield an inch to anybody. He unfurled his true colors on every occasion, which I think is beautifully written by Wise about Isaac Leeser, to understand what kind of a man he was, staunch defender of orthodoxy, which is something that you do. You mentioned this earlier. You take up in the book the kind of silly claim by conservatives that he was conservative.
Right. So, I think there may be a touch of, this idea of Achrei Mot Kadoshim in this, and I think some of the bumps in the road are smoothed out. However, Wise is absolutely correct that in the period prior to the Civil War, Leeser is without peer in America as the person who stood up for Judaism, for Jews to practice Judaism, for Jews to learn Judaism, for Jews to be proud of Judaism and their heritage, and that they were second to none. And he, even though that was not how he started out, that was not his goal. Once he embraced it, I think Wise is right. He was a tiger, and he never let go of it until his last breath. When he dies, by the way, it's not just Wise who says that, but it was one of the first truly great funerals in American Jewish history. There have been some massive funerals, like, for example, when the Yiddish writer Shalom Aleichem died, or when the first chief rabbi of New York City dies. There are hundreds of thousands of people in the street in New York City. When Leeser dies, thousands and thousands of people lined the streets of Philadelphia. B'nai B'rith had one carriage after another. They went past all the synagogues. They opened the doors to it, and they took them out to West Philadelphia. So it was realized in his own time, whether you fought with him or whether you worked with him, that this was an extraordinary person. And I'm going to use the word hero. He was a hero of Judaism, of the Jewish people. And that's why I'm so glad that my teachers directed me to study him. I think it's any young aspiring rabbi should read something that inspires them to do their work.
Absolutely, he was, and it's important that he be remembered. Never married, never had children. You can go to his kever, which is in Philadelphia.
His books and his spiritual descendants are his children.
Absolutely, and I want to get to suggested reading. Your book, first of all, is suggested reading. I'll link to that. But of Leeser's, is there any one book, if just to give a flavor, if anyone wanted to just pick something up of Leeser's that you would recommend, try reading that?
I would just take the first volume of The Occident. It's available. It's online. And people should know that the University of Pennsylvania has created an online archives of Leeser. It's about 50,000 documents, and I would invite people to go. I was involved early in that project, and then it had its own life, but they did a fabulous job. So University of Pennsylvania, Isaac Leeser online, and you can search as much as you want. But if you're going to try and read one thing, open The Occident, and you will get a clear sense of, in his opening essay in introducing The Occident, what his purpose was, what his goals were, etc. That's where I would send people.
I'll link to that. I'll link to also one of the volumes of discourses. I can link to a bunch of things, and the University of Pennsylvania, I'll link to that in the show notes. And just finally, to end off, what would you say Isaac Leeser's legacy is?
Isaac Leeser's legacy has been realized several times in several different ways in this country, where at one point the conservative movement really found strength for Judaism in America. Then at the end of the 20th century, the Reform movement found strength in attracting Jews to Judaism. And now in the 21st century, Orthodox traditional Judaism, which would have been the type he himself would have favored. I mean, he wouldn't have known about Lithuania or Galician or any of those, or the Baba Sali or any of that. But I think he would say, you see, it's possible. It's possible that you can be in America with all of its temptations without any guardrails, that if you're educated and grounded in Judaism, you can do it here. And you know, for the most part, I know we have our problems with anti-Semitism today. In this society, at least by law, we're unmolested in our practice of Judaism. We have plenty of enemies, unfortunately, today, and they're very active. But at least by law, we are unmolested as a religious minority, and this is a place for Judaism to flourish. I think he would be very happy. You said you went to yeshiva in Bala to him, it would have been, Gan Eden, that there would have been that such a thing would have become possible in America.
Yeah, the Philadelphia Yeshiva. Yeah, it would have been something he fought tenaciously for, and he
Especially
definitely
he was there, and it was such a tough terrain for him. So
he would definitely be very proud to see what's happening today. So, he's Zechor Baruch, and thank you, Professor Sussman, for joining me to discuss Isaac Leeser.
This was a wonderful talk, and I thank you deeply for reading it so deeply and your wonderful questions.
So for this part of the episode, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Elazar Meisels, who is the Dean of Surah Shneur Institute of Higher Education. He's a Magachir on Torah Anytime, the Sforno and others, Mechaber Sfarim. And we will now talk about Isaac Leeser's impact on Torah, on, I guess we'll call it, from Jewry, Torah Jewry, and his broader and wider impact until today. So first of all, let's start by thank you, Rabbi Meisels, for joining me.
Pleasure. Thank you.
We should start off by introducing you, even though we're here at the end of this long episode, but we should introduce you to the listeners and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, and also what your connection to Isaac Leeser is.
Okay, so that's actually a very fascinating story. Who am I? What am I? As you said, I'm the Dean of Surah Shneur Institute of Higher Education, which in this context actually has a lot of relevance to how I came to Isaac Leeser. Because in Surah Shneur, what we try to do is we try to offer degrees, higher education degrees to the frum community in a manner that is uncompromised. And we work really, really hard to do that. And in my role as dean, that's my job, is to oversee. We ourselves, and this is an important piece, we ourselves don't actually confer degrees. Rather, we partner with various colleges. We have about 10 university partners with whom we partner, and that's how we give degrees. It's a very large program. We're doing it for about 48 years. We have well over 35,000 graduates by this point, so we're fairly well known in the community. Now, what happened was, probably about 10 years ago, we started a partnership with a college that is no longer in existence, but at the time, it was a very fine institution, Concordia College of Bronxville, New York. And Concordia College of Bronxville, New York, we were in the middle of negotiating our way through a partnership. And because they were a Christian college, they were actually Lutheran, so they were very sensitive to our religious and cultural sensitivities, which made them an ideal partner for us. There was one problem, however, and that is that as part of their Common Core, every college has what they call a Common Core. Every single student has to take all of those courses. As part of their Common Core, there was one course, and that course became the sticking point for this entire relationship, because this course was History in America, and according to their constitution, could only be taught by a reverend of the Lutheran Church. And I said, guys, that's not happening. No reverend, no Lutheran reverend is teaching our beautiful, wonderful Jewish students who joined us because they are so culturally conscious and so careful. It's not going to happen. It's not going to work. And ultimately, we came to an understanding that I could be considered the reverend, especially since I have a longstanding interest in history. I can be considered like a reverend, and I can teach this course. Now, History in America, religion in America, History 351, religion in America, the religion they were really referring to was Christianity. How am I teaching Christianity, which I'm obviously not? So what I did was, with their permission, I reformulated the course, and it became History in America, how Judaism and Christianity, so to speak, coexisted in the very early formative years of the United States of America. And what it was the story of how Judaism tried to establish itself and the problems that it encountered at the hands of the dominant population, which was a Christian population. Over the course of this study and through the course, which became a course that I gave to thousands of students. So I came in contact with so many of the familiar figures that you're having on this series, Gershom Mendesatius, Rabbi Rice, Rabbi Lois, Abato Morey, and Isaac Leeser. Every one of them is an impressive individual. Every one of them made a significant contribution. Every one of them in their own right did something very, very special for their time. However, far and away, the personality, the impact that Isaac Leeser had on American Judaism, to my mind, was something that is wholly underappreciated. We today, when we think about who are the founders of American Judaism, so especially if you're a Litvak, you think about Mr. Mendelovich, you think about Mike Tress, you think about Aaron Kotler, you think about the Tulsa Rosh Yeshivas, Rav Mottel Katz, and Rav Meir Bloch, and Rav Soloveitchik, and all of them were exceedingly important. But all of them only started operating from 1935 and on. We're talking about well before. We're talking about before 1850. Many of these people were already operating in a vastly more empty landscape than they were. And the impact that somebody like Leeser had, it's almost tragic because he left over no generations. He didn't get married. And therefore, he left over no children. And there's very little that people actually remember about him. I recall as a child reading a Jewish Observer article about Isaac Leeser and saying to myself, how is it that we don't know more about this individual? How is it that the world isn't acquainted? And when I started to study him, I realized that this was a person to whom I can say with confidence, literally every single Jew alive today in America owes, in probably no small measure, a great deal of thanks to Isaac Leeser and the work that he did. Let me explain to you why. If I were to tell you, let's think about people that we're familiar with, whom we would say love or don't love their work, it's irrelevant. But we would say they had a significant impact on religious Judaism in America today. So I think you'd be forgiven for saying that Rabbi Meir Zlotowitz and Lahavim Chaim Rabbi Nosson Sherman, with the introduction of Art Scroll, translating books, making them available to the wider public, I think everybody would agree they had a significant impact. Okay, Rabbi Dr. Joseph Kamenetsky and the people who founded Torah Messiah, tremendous impact, founding day schools all over America. What an unbelievable thing to do. Whoever started the first religious magazine or newspaper in America, whatever that'll be. Think of the founder, or even just go not so far back. Whoever started Mishpach and Ami. I mean, these are magazines that make their way in. Yad Neman and Hamodia right there. Tremendous impact. Okay, then let's talk about who made yeshivas. Every one of those people, all of them, huge impact. Who founded a hospital, who battled reform. We think about Shamshon Fall Hirsch. Okay, he did many things, but among the things that he's famous for, he battled reform. Isaac Leeser did every single thing I just mentioned in his time. And the most fascinating thing about him is that Isaac Leeser did not actually have a real position. Yes, he was a chazan because he could sing, he could sing to some degree. He could sing. He wasn't actually a great chazan in that sense. But in other words, he could daven for the Amud, which most people couldn't. And he could also deliver a sermon, which most people couldn't, even though he himself was the first one to admit that he wasn't the world's biggest Talmud Chacham. But he could do okay. He could do a fairly good job. So Isaac Leeser was not really a person whom anybody would have thought, like, okay, this is the man who is going to really lay the foundations and the groundwork in America. But Isaac Leeser was the one who founded the art school of its time. He was the one who helped found the first Jewish day school. He founded the first Jewish hospital in Philadelphia. He was the one who founded the first major magazine, The Occident and the American and the Jewish Advocate, the American Jewish Advocate. So he founded the first magazine, the first Jewish magazine that had a readership in the many thousands and went all over America, went outside of America as well. And nobody more than he actually battled reform. So you're talking about, and he did many things on top of that. You know, we think about in the early days of the Yishuv, Rav Kook Zatzal and Rav Zalman Meltzer Zatzal and others did a chizik tour around Eretz Yisrael. Now, how long do you think it took them to go all around Eretz Yisrael? How much did they travel? It was hard. It was very difficult for them. What people don't realize, in 1851, from 1851 to 1852, Isaac Leeser traveled 5,200 miles. 1851, this man traveled around America 5,200 miles. He didn't have a car. This was on trains, on horseback, on, the most primitive forms of transportation. He walked He went from community to community to community to give chizuk, to give guidance to Yidden all over America. Who appointed him to do so? He wasn't a musmach. He wasn't hired to be anybody's rabbi. But this was a Yid who was such a loichem. He was such a battler for Hashem and for his Torah and for Yiddishkeit that he felt he has no choice. He was the provost. People don't realize that. Most people might not even know what a provost is. So a provost is actually, he's not quite the president, but he's call him the vice president, the one in the college who makes everything happen. He was the provost of what's known as Maimonides College. Maimonides College was the first rabbinical school in America. That means he was the one who said, we need real rabbis. We need real rabbis, and we need to do it and do it now. And therefore, he helped establish a college. The college didn't last. It lasted for a couple of years. It created some nice rabbis. Eventually, it became Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan. Later on, that's how that developed. Ultimately, JTS, and then Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan. So he certainly had a tremendous impact in that sense. But this was a person who founded what's known as the Occident. We'll talk about that in a second. But he was just incredible in the number of areas in which he impacted American Jewry. I don't think there's anyone, we think about a person like Reb Shraga Feivel Mendelovich, who was influential in so many different ways, yeshivas and certain publications and teacher training. It's incredible, unbelievable what he accomplished. But Isaac Leeser was involved in so many more things than just that. And he really saw it as his mission to do all that and more, even though nobody appointed him. And he was constantly battling, always underfunded, never had a penny to his name. This was a man who had no support. He would complain bitterly about how his opponents, the Reform, they had tons of support. They had endless amounts of money. He had none. And he would say, how is it fair that I have to work so hard when I am actually fighting the cause for the Rebbeinu Shalom? But never stopped him. He continued to go. He had one position, and that was the position where he was sort of as I said, the Chazan in Mikveh Yisrael. Mikveh Yisrael is one of the oldest shuls, and it's going on for a few hundred years already with a constant minyan in Philadelphia. And he actually gave up that position. And the reason he gave up that position was because he wanted to set a different precedent. In America, in those days, the way it worked was the rabbi or the chazan who served in the function of the rabbi was actually controlled by the board. And Isaac Leeser said, there'll never be Yiddishkeit in America if we allow the rabbi to be controlled by the board. He resigned his position. He ultimately opened up his own breakaway shul, and there he was in charge, and the board was subservient to him. And he set a model, and that was a model that slowly but surely began to take hold, began to take root in America, which was such an important thing, because the rabbis weren't, in those early years, they weren't nearly as capable, not nearly as proficient as they became in subsequent years when rabbis from Russia, from Eastern Europe, when they showed up, and these were people who were serious Talmidei Chacham, but the rabbis until then weren't. And because they were so wholly controlled by their boards, they had very, very meager impact. So, and they couldn't really fight the battle themselves. Isaac Leeser was the one who gave so many of them the strength to say that we are ultimately responsible for the spiritual well-being of our congregants.
A couple things to add. So you already mentioned the Occident, which for decades, the Occident, like you're saying, it's like the Mishpacha, the Ami, the Ated, the everything rolled together. It's
the only thing that existed.
And he's publishing, he's the newspaper publisher. He's translating Tanakh. He's publishing the Art Scroll, if you will, which is in use for decades after he died.
Chumash.
He actually started the original
Siddur.
JPS.
He translated the Siddur, the Chumash, the entire Tanakh. He was the first Jew to translate Tanakh. Until then, everybody was relying on a Christian translation.
Basically coming from the King James. Then he even started the first JPS, Jewish Publication Society. Also, fell apart and started after, like you said, he started at college. He was a chazan. He was running around. He was fighting reform. I said in the episode with Professor Sussman how Isaac Meir Wise, they had a reform, and his long-standing opponent said after he died, he gave like a eulogy, like a hesped. Right. He said that Leeser was the one defending the Orthodox, and without him, what's going to happen in Taka?
Right. Leeser
was mamish. Yeah.
Leeser was the only person capable, and I don't even know if he was actually capable, because Wise was so much more articulate, so much better funded. Wise was a very powerful and very beloved person. He was actually a fairly nice guy. Isaac Mayer Wise, unfortunately, he was fairly nice. And Leeser was not looking for friends. He was not looking to make friends. So Wise had an easier time. But Leeser said in his April 1843 edition of The Occident, which was his first publication, he said, "My purpose is the spread of whatever can advance the cause of our religion." He was a leichem. He was not waiting for anybody to give him a pat on the shoulder or to give him his marching orders. He says, "I am going to do whatever it is." And he says, he promised, he said, "I will omit no opportunity to defend the religion which we profess." In other words, whatever it's going to take. I'll make enemies. I'll have to raise funds. He wrote most of the paper himself. He wrote it. He edited it. He would stamp it and mail it. All the work was done by him primarily.
And as you say, it's a shame that so many people did not hear. I think if you go to the average person today, say Isaac Leeser, who? No idea. And it's not only that he was involved in all these institutions, he even wrote. So we have volumes and volume of his discourses, which I should mention. I have a friend, Simon Springer, Early American Rabbis. He's actually published. He just put on Amazon. He's like put a new font, new layout, and so on of discourse. I think volume 1 is out.
Right.
And so there's the discourses, there's the Occident, years and years of that. There's his Jews in the Mosaic Law, there's his translations. He wrote lots of things. He was so important, influential, and the average person has no idea who he is or that he's buried nearby from where we're recording in Philadelphia.
Right. So many people go to Philadelphia. I always tell this to people. You're going to Philadelphia, drop into the Beis Olam, and say a capital Tehillim by him, because this is a person to whom we're all chayv. I'll tell you something else he took on in his Occident, which was, again, people wouldn't even imagine this, but he wrote in his first edition, he started warning people about Christian missionaries. And he said, watch out for them, and especially watch out for their chesed, watch out for their kindness, because every single thing they're doing is to try to draw Yidden away to Christianity. And that's what was happening in large scale. And Isaac Leeser was the only person who took up the cause and started battling the missionaries. And he warned them. He would issue threats to them that this is not going to work. This is not how it's going to happen. So it was really quite incredible. He himself, it was interesting. He saw himself. He quoted the Navi Yecheskel. The Navi Yecheskel, if you look over the Empiric Lamed Gimel, where he has this nevuah, where Hashem says, if you're going to see a cherev, if you're going to see that there's an attacking army coming against the city, are you going to sit by quietly? No, you're going to get up, you're going to grab the shofar, and you're going to warn everybody. He said, that's my job. I see all the threats that Yiddishkeit is facing today, and I will not remain silent. Like he almost saw himself in that sense, like he was the Navi Yecheskel. He didn't compare himself to Yecheskel, but in terms of how he assumed that mission on his own, that was his point. He said, somebody's got to fight. Everybody else that you're going to feature in the series, they weren't necessarily battling for the soul of Yiddishkeit. They were doing their jobs. He was a Rav. He was a fabulous Rav. He was a Moil. He was, the next thing. He was a Chazan. Each one in their own way did what they did so beautifully. But Isaac Leeser was unique. He was so unique in that he said, I don't have a job. I will fight every battle that needs to be fought, L'man Hashem, L'man Tegrasa. And at the time, he may not have looked to be as successful as history ultimately revealed him to be. He was far, far more successful than he ever dreamed he was, because he laid the foundations in so many areas for those who came later. He was nifter in 1868. And it was another 12 to 15 years before the big, large waves of immigration came. But when those immigrants came, they found a vastly different Jewish America than they would have found had Isaac Leeser not devoted most of his life to laying those foundations for them.
I think we should add here before we end for the listener, why are we doing this? So they have a whole episode with Professor Sussman, who has a wonderful book, Isaac Leeser and the Making of American Judaism. We discussed his biography, but why this little addenda? And we should mention that we, the two of us, have been discussing this for a number of years. You reached out to me a couple of years ago. He said, Naki, you have to do an episode on Leeser. I said, yes, eventually one day, and so on and so forth. So if you want to add in, when you heard I was doing this series, he said, no, you want to come and just emphasize his importance today, and that the Olam needs to know, basically.
The Olam needs to know this because, A, we owe him a Karas HaTov. As I said earlier, I'm a grandson, one of the older grandchildren of Mike Tress, Zechron Levracha. So I know the history of those whom we think of and we say, these were the founders, these were the bricklayers, these were the ones who poured the foundation of the modern Jewish world in America, the Torah world in America as we know it. And that's true. But, as Rashi says, Le'ani Tchilas HaKedusha. Even they were not Tchilas HaKedusha for all that they did. And everything they did was out of this world, incredible. But there were people who came before them. And that's why this series is important, to give credit, to make people aware of what those battles were and how hard people were fighting for this in those early stages. And they've really laid the groundwork so that when a Rabaran came, so that when a Rav Soloveitchik, so that when all of these great people came, they had something to work with, that there were even a few yeshivas, that there was a Torah Das, that there was a Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, was credit solely to these individuals who did it. And especially in the case of Isaac Leeser, not only his impact, but the fact that he didn't leave over any children. I feel it should be a zecher for his neshama. He was nifter on Ches Shvat. His full name was Yitzchak ben Uri Eliezer. And if anybody can make a point, go to Philadelphia. We go for Alam in Ezach and for all kinds of visits on Chalamayid and other times to go to Philadelphia. You should know, dort licht a yid, that we can go and say thank you to him and be mala his neshama, although I'm sure he gets enormous chussim for what he did. But everybody can have a chelik in being makar tov to this unusual and really incredible personality.
Yeah, and his kever you can look up on forum.com. There's a whole bunch of different cemeteries. Just look, it has it right there which one that he's at.
There's three. And he's in the old one, but it's very easy to find.
Yeah, and like I said, his discourses are being reprinted now. Maybe the Occident's available online, but hopefully at some point it should be redone. It's easy to take his stuff, put it in print, maybe especially Amazon print on demand these days, and you can read it. It's still fascinating to look back and read
online. It is fascinating to read it. Read letters that people in Charleston, South Carolina, people all over America, and they would say, we wait for your paper. We wait for this for months because till it would show up. It was a monthly until it showed up.
There was no podcast. There was no social media. That's how they found out the Jewish news.
This was it. If you got the news 6 months after it happened, you were in on the hawk like nobody else. So yeah, and he was the one who made that possible. He kept Yidden who were Beidim, who were scattered all over America and had absolutely no connection. He kept them connected to their roots, to their faith, in ways that nobody else possibly could. So, should be an ilu for his neshama, and thank you for what you're doing, Nachi.
Yes, he's the Baruch. Thank you, Rabbi Meisels, for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you.